What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another Angle of Pursuit podcast, your fantasy football, sports betting, and NASCAR home here at fakepigskin.com. I am your host, Kyle Robert. You follow me on Twitter at NotoriousKRO. With me once again is Brian Twining. Brian, we are talking wide receivers today. How's it going?
It's going good. And last but not least, we're to the wide receivers here for our top 12 rankings. I mean, this could potentially be the league winning position for your rosters when you're routinely playing two, sometimes three of these guys. And there's always an extreme amount of depth at the position. And coming into a season with COVID, you're more than likely going to have to roster at least one or two more of these guys than you normally would.
Yeah, I think we'll obviously talk our top options. We'll talk the guys that just missed the cut. We'll talk a bunch of stuff, but um in general, I'm a wide receiver heavy drafter. Obviously I think you're pretty much there with me. There has been kind of a shift where I might go one stud running back early and then go receiver heavy, and then but yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting season to kind of see how it all shakes out. Um, we're talking top 12 wide receivers. For me, this was the toughest position to rank. I feel like there's three or four guys that are stand out above the rest as potential wide receiver ones. That I feel like there's a huge cluster from 4, 5 to 15, 16, 17. For you, does that make you more inclined to be more comfortable waiting at the position, or does that say, hey, there's a bunch of guys that I really really like, and I'm going to try and get a couple of them early? I guess where do you fall on the? There's a lot of good wide receivers, so what do you do?
There might be a lot of good wide receivers, and it's something that I've kind of noticed over the last couple of years with the league transitioning into this more college style run shoot. Like each team is throwing 35 plus times a game, unless you're the Ravens or the Titans. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that the elite guys are the guys that you want because they're getting the consistent targets, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about production or teams passing. It's which guys are you going to be trying to get that are seeing those targets and those opportunities, which are king in fantasy. And I think that kind of lends to the strategy of going after the number one wide receivers, even if there is value later in the draft. Like we talked about it a couple episodes ago about how I actually think Calvin Ridley is in for a pretty big boost in production this year. And, I think that's one instance where I'd be willing to wait and take a number two on a team. But when it comes to these other guys that are on teams with multiple options, that number one guy is still going to eat, you know, 30% of all the air yards and all the targets for that team, which makes me want to get that guy early on in the draft rather than wait for the number two option on that team.
Yeah, and I'm 100% with you. Like this idea of, well, there's so many good ones, I can just wait. I'm not really on board with it. And it's funny how the narrative kind of transitions, because last year, so I basically went through and looked at how many running backs and how many receivers missed a bunch of games. I kind of I looked at the top 12 options at both positions. I went through it. Last year, the average running back missed barely like 1.5 games, and their average ADP shift was only like 7 spots. And whereas receivers missed almost 4 games, and their average ADP shift was 27, 28. Like, so there's a lot of, well, running backs are fine. They're safe. Look at how receivers are. But if you go back to 3 years before that, like in 2018, the receivers were off by 3 points or 3 spots in ADP, but running backs were off 25. You go back a year before that, it was basically equal. Go back before that, running backs were 28. There's a lot more volatility, and this feels like the year. Like it's funny because I was going through some old drafts, getting ready for some of my home leagues, and there was a year where Jeremy Hill, Justin Forsett, and CJ Anderson were all first round picks. And now it's like, what were we doing in 2015? Like, I get running backs are like you need them, you need to have them, and obviously like that is a big part of why I want running backs. And traditionally, if I grab 4 receivers that I love, then I'm not really worried about the position, and I could rotate all those guys through at running back, and also like not feeling tied to somebody because I spent an early round pick on them. But it's just funny how the year before really drives ADP going into the following season.
Yeah, no joke when it comes to that kind of stuff. I mean, the one guy who we're seeing skyrocket up boards right now, and we've seen his ADP kind of fluctuate over the last few weeks, but that's Chris Godwin, who he had, a monstrous season with under Bruce Arians and Jameis Winston, and he was a guy who was barely even on, draft boards at the very beginning of last season's, redraft leagues, who near the beginning of the season, more and more people started to get on the train, and we saw his ADP jump up there. But he was a guy who, this year we're looking at a potential top 5 guy on some guys' teams. People are picking him maybe to finish first at the position with Tom Brady there. So I mean, we're talking about previous season really driving what people are doing at a position. I think he's like a guy who fits that very well.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And it's funny how like last year he was a guy I was targeting everywhere because I thought he had that upside.
Mm-hmm.
But if he's priced at his upside, it becomes a guy that I'm not interested in anymore.
Oh yeah, and then because if they don't hit that cost that you're spending on them in the draft, then you lost the opportunity to get a guy who's valued, who's slipped at that position.
Yeah, and you really have to set, if you think Chris Godwin's going to be playing a lot of slot and they're not going to be running a lot of 12 personnel and he's going to be killing it like he was last year, then obviously pay his draft day price. But if you think, OJ Howard's there and Gronkowski and they're going to be a lot more 12 personnel and maybe a little more outside play, which I think Chris Godwin can absolutely. And we talked to Matt Harmon about him, and I'm not saying he's a bad receiver. I'm not saying he's like not worth taking. I think at his price he might be a little aggressive. But let's talk our top 12 options, and let's start with our number 1 overall. Tell me why Michael Thomas is not the number 1 option.
I have nothing to say.
Exactly.
For anybody to think that there's anybody other than Michael Thomas as the number 1 option, even with the addition of Emmanuel Sanders, I believe that they're living in an alternate reality. Like they've been watching too many sci-fi movies, because this guy and Drew Brees are like yin and yang. He is to Drew Brees what peanut butter is to jelly. Like they just go so well together. I don't think we've seen a connection like this since Jerry Rice and Joe Montana in their early years. Like, dude,
I'm 100% on board. Like he's the clear.
It's
number
ridiculous.
1. And it's funny too because as we go through these names, there's holes you could poke in a lot of these guys. There's one reason or another where obviously I think there's 5, 6, 7 guys who could be the wide receiver 1 come to the end of the season. But there's something there that kind of holds you back just a little bit. Thomas has the upside. We saw it. And I mean, the fact that there's another pass catcher there is the biggest like downside for him. Like I love that Emmanuel Sanders is there and Jared Cook's there and Alvin Kamara's there, because then they can't triple cover him. And maybe, he's still going to get volume. He's still going to be productive. He's still going to score touchdowns. Like I don't really see much of a downside unless he gets hurt. And that's a downside any player can have. So, but as I mentioned, this is just a generally really tough set of rankings to do because I love so many of these names. So let's dive into my rankings, and we can pick them apart. And I feel like this is the one of any of the positions we've done. I feel like I could shift the most on a lot of these names. So there are my top 12 wide receivers for 2020. As you can see, Michael Thomas is number 1. Julio, Tyreek Hill, Davante Adams are kind of that next cluster for me. I love all of these guys. I would be very happy to have them as my wide receiver 1. If you want to rank Davante or Tyreek or even Julio as your wide receiver 1, I'm not going to give you a ton of pushback. I still think Thomas is the correct answer. But if you want to put Thomas 2 and put Julio or Tyreek or Adams 1, like I'll respect it. And then the next, like, I don't know, 10 guys, like I'm 5 through 12, and you could go all the way down to 15. There's some names that you are going to mention in your top 12 that didn't make mine, that if they're inside your top 12 options, I wouldn't fault you at all. I think DeAndre Hopkins is an interesting case. Traditionally, we don't see big name receivers move, especially via trade, at their prime. Like normally they're at the back end of their career, or they're Antonio Brown, they're losing their mind, and for one reason or the other end up on new teams, or like we're the whole Randy Moss situation. But he's stepping into an offense that's going to throw the ball all over the yard. A second year of Kyler Murray. Obviously, moving into a new offense, but this is a guy who's excelled with Brian Hoyer and Tom Savage and Brock Osweiler, and obviously as of late Deshaun Watson, who's on his own, like, completely different level than anybody else he's ever played with. But knowing that he's walking into an offense where there's going to be opportunity, knowing that he's walking into an offense where Kyler Murray is a very reliable option, even in his second season, I have a lot less questions and concerns, even with a season that has an interesting offseason, has fewer preseason games, has less OTAs. I still feel really good about him, even though I ranked him 6.
Yeah, Hopkins was a guy who he's been really tough for me to kind of gauge as to what we're going to see with this, this whole thing happening where they haven't really been able to get on the field and practice together, which I don't really know how much that's going to affect the rapport that he develops with Kyler Murray, who himself is only coming into his second season. And, as much as I love Larry Fitzgerald, who I think is the GOAT, Hopkins is stepping into that alpha dog role for that team, and he will be the clear number one target on the outside for them in an offense that saw Kyler Murray throw the ball 570 plus times last year, who they're also going to throw the ball 40 plus times a game, and they're going to want Kyler to get the ball out of his hands without taking as many hits. And where better to throw than this guy who has, like, probably the best catch radius of any wide receiver other than Michael Thomas, and who can make some spectacular catches. So out of your top 6 guys, I think he is somebody who could definitely finish, right behind or on par with Michael Thomas, with going into an offense that's going to throw it as much as they are, with a Larry Fitzgerald and a Christian Kirk and a Kenyon Drake there as well, to limit the ability of teams' defenses to kind of shadow and, umbrella coverage Hopkins.
Yeah, and 80 and drafters are right there with you. Like right now, that per fantasy football calculator, it's Thomas, it's Davante Adams, it's DeAndre Hopkins. Like that is the top 3. Tyreek Hill's right there too. All those guys are going inside the first round in half PPR drafts. So clearly, people drafting are very comfortable, as we are, of him stepping in and being a factor right away. I'm going to throw up your rankings so we can go through the first half, because there's obviously a little bit of a shuffle, but a lot of the same names. So, and then we can kind of dive into the back half, because I think that's where it gets interesting. Thomas, Adams, Tyreek, Evans, Hopkins, Julio. I think it's funny, and maybe it's because we've just done so much content together, but we both have Evans in there, in our top 6. Obviously you have Godwin 7. I didn't rank Godwin. That's probably a mistake on my part, but I have a little more concern about him playing on the outside. And once again, I love pretty much any receiver from I would take any of these, like, top, I don't know, 25 or 30 guys feel super, super compelling, and I would like to have a couple of them as I start drafts.
I think Mike Evans is probably one of the most interesting names in that first half of guys, because we saw the initial reaction to Tom Brady signing in Tampa was the Chris Godwin hype again. It was, oh, it's this guy who plays the slots very similarly to Julian Edelman, who Tom Brady has loved over the last few years there in New England, who is just going to see the most of the targets out of this offense. And people were forgetting the fact that this guy Mike Evans, who even without playing a full slate of games, he's never had less than 118 targets in a season, which was last year, which was his least amount. He's never had less than 1,000 yards receiving. He's had 5 or more touchdowns in 5 of his 6 years. He's averaging upwards of 80 to 85 yards a game. And this is with the likes of Jameis Winston and Mike Glennon and Ryan Fitzpatrick back there playing quarterback. And now he gets this guy named Tom Brady, who is only the best quarterback to ever play in the NFL, who, regardless of what people think about his arm strength, he made Randy Moss, a guy who was absolute garbage in Oakland, go back to being the Minnesota Vikings Randy Moss. So I'm not comparing Evans to Randy Moss just yet, but Evans is a guy who I think could be the wide receiver 1 this year if we're looking at a full season of him playing and he's healthy with Tom Brady in a Bruce Arians offense.
Yeah, no, I think the comparison is apt. Like they both like to stretch the field. They make plays. They're incredibly athletic in the air. They can do a lot. Obviously, Evans has the ability where if Brady throws it off a little bit off target, he can turn around, make a play in the air, catch the ball. Doing this receiving and as we've kind of run through the names, I feel like Tom Brady needs to go higher in my quarterback rankings. I feel like if I love Evans and I think Godwin can be really good, and I think they between Gronk and OJ Howard they get a top 7 to 12 type tight end, and obviously we both love Rojo. Brady needs to be higher, and I'm like working on my projections, and that's why kind of working on like a whole projection system it's a lot of work and kind of a pain in the ass, but it's also really beneficial in terms of, if these guys are going to put up these numbers and these guys are going to put up these numbers and these guys are going to put up these numbers, then the quarterback that's facilitating all this has to put up a monster season or somebody else is going to be playing. So like right now I'm 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns is kind of what I'm looking at for Brady. And if I'm going to be there, like I need to rank him higher, and it's just, and obviously that's why I like doing what we're doing, because
I think
really,
yeah, I was just going to say that I think the issue with Tom Brady, however, though, even with looking at that and realizing that, we're probably undervaluing what he's going to be in fantasy, is the fact that Brady, he offers 0 rushing. And, most of the guys that are up there in that top, every single guy that's in the top 6, basically, it has legs. Mahomes, Jackson, Murray, Prescott, Wilson, Watson, all 6 of those guys are going to run the ball. And then you have Josh Allen, and then, Drew Brees, who's going to throw the ball 40 times a game, but is like the most efficient passer in the NFL.
yeah.
And I mean, for him to get into that level in fantasy, in terms of fantasy, he's going to have that monster year with 35 plus, close to 40 passing touchdowns.
Yeah, no, and Brady definitely has the I'm transitioning to a new offense. I'm learning it on the fly. He was even making comments about kind of the difficulties of, because he hasn't had to learn anything new since basically early 2000s. So it's been a little bit of an eye-opening experience. Obviously, incredibly smart guy, even though he went to that team up north, and got his degree from there, but that's another story. But yeah, I think he's a guy that I probably, and if he's 13 instead of 12, like I think it's probably fine. Let's talk Julio, a guy that gets slept on. Obviously, you have him 6th. I'm quite a bit higher at having him at number 2. But like I said, that whole cluster, I think it's kind of a counterbalance of a lot of names. But in terms of Julio's draft ADP at wide receiver and his finish at wide receiver, it doesn't get much better. Last year he was third receiver off the board, fifth receiver in ADP. Fourth receiver off the board, fifth receiver in ADP in 2018. 2017, second receiver off the board, sixth at the end of the season. 2016, second off the board, sixth at the end of the season. 2015, second off the board, second at the end of the season. 2014, fifth off the board, eighth at the end of the season. 2013 was an injury year, so obviously finished 66, not great. Second off the board in 2012, ninth overall. 2011 was his first season. He was a top 30 receiver, finished 17th. This is a guy that finishes basically where he was drafted, and he's so rock solid. I'm incredibly bullish on this Falcons offense. I think Julio has a monster year, obviously. Calvin Ridley. I think Todd Gurley is going to fall a round or two and be a credible value. Hayden Hurst is awesome. I think their defense is going to be pretty bad, so I think they're going to throw a lot. Obviously, the return of Dirk Cutter helps. So I'm all aboard the Julio hype train. I don't care if he scores 4 touchdowns.
Which would be so disappointing because I will probably wind up having a couple shares myself of Julio, as he's traditionally been one of my favorite wide receivers because of his ridiculous amount of production, even without scoring touchdowns. But I've said this before with him, he's just been so ridiculously good that I'm not trying to predict the season where he doesn't produce that amount, but I can just see Calvin Ridley kind of stepping into that 1B role where he sees a little bit higher percentage of the targets this season than we've seen in his first 2 years. But Julio is a guy who, I pulled up his numbers. I'm looking at him right now. He only twice over the last 6 years has he not averaged 100 yards a game, which is ridiculous for the position. And when talking about the elite of the elite, you're getting a guy 4th or 5th off the board at the position for, somebody who's finishing on a weekly basis as in the top 5 at the position is tremendous value as compared to, we were talking pre-show about guys getting the middle tier or the back end of the running backs just to fill the running back position. So Julio will be a guy who I'll be looking at a lot. And then, like you said, with this Atlanta offense, their defense is going to be bad. Mm-hmm. This entire division is going to be shootouts because Carolina's defense is crap. Mm-hmm. New Orleans, we don't really know what we're going to see out of them on defense. And then Tampa Bay, they're young, but
like they both, I think New Orleans and Tampa have the ability to be really good, and we've seen flashes from them, but we've also seen them not be so good. So I'm 100% with you. And in terms of like ability for Calvin Ridley to step forward and Julio to be really good, this is a team that lost like 39.6 of their targets from last year left. So there's plenty of opportunity for Ridley to be better and Julio to still do what he does and Hayden Hurst to still do what he does and for Todd Gurley to be involved in the passing game. I think, and then obviously Laquan Treadwell's there, but he's not doing anything. He's just going to be kind of standing in the corner. He'll have 1 catch at like week 7.
Don't forget about Russell Gage, though. He's a guy who, late in drafts is a great ad if Julio or Ridley were to ever get injured.
100%. Like if you're doing best ball drafts, I love the idea of Julio and then Gurley in round 2 or 3, and then Matt Ryan, and then Hayden Hurst, and then Russell Gage. And Brian Hill. I think if you can get some combination of those guys, like you're gonna be loving life. It's gonna be so much fun. Like I would love to look up odds for like the team to score the most points this season because I would back Atlanta in a heartbeat.
I was just going to say, I think in a lot of dailies, it's going to be a lot of NFC South players.
Yep. Okay. So let's keep it rolling. Let's talk some more wideouts. Let's go with your back half. What was there a name, like of the guys that you ranked inside your top 12, who was the hardest to kind of find a way to squeeze in there? Was there anybody you were kind of going back and forth on?
Well, I guess for me, it would be the last guy in who I kind of went back and forth on what I was going to do with him. And that'd be Adam Thielen, who, he's a guy who over the last couple of years, he's been right there at tops at the position for production, even in an offense led by, Kirk Cousins, who, yeah, we like the production out of the wide receivers, but we don't like that as far as him as a quarterback. And now Thielen is minus his his co-threat in Stephon Diggs with a rookie stepping in there, Justin Jefferson, who a lot of people like, but he's a rookie, and we don't really know what we're going to see. And it's such a pass-heavy offense, and I think the only reason why I put him in there was the fact that he will be the el numero uno, and there will be no question about that on the outside for him. I mean, prior to last year where he got hurt and he only played 10 games, he had 140 and 150 plus targets each of those seasons. And I can only envision a full season of Thielen seeing even 160, 170 targets now. So, it I think at that level, he'll be a guy who, as a wide receiver 2, you're going to be getting a tremendous value, who could be a wide receiver 1 for the duration of the fantasy season.
I love Adam Thielen this year. I think he does, I think he excels in kind of an outside role. I think he moves to what Stephon Diggs used to do, with Justin Jefferson being more of that slot guy, and kind of operating in the areas where Adam Thielen used to produce. And I think obviously this is a team that we expect to run the ball. But if their defense isn't quite as good as we've seen in previous years, which it definitely has the ability to, if they have to throw a little bit more, if Cousins leans on the guy that he's had there, as much as we like what Jefferson can be, as much as we expect Irv Smith to take a little bit of a step forward, Kyle Rudolph's still there, obviously. But I think there's going to be, Adam Thielen could have a 150 target Julio type season. Like, he could have a 150 targets, 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns, and become a top 5 option at the end of the season, that you're getting kind of in that third round range. Like, there's so many compelling cases in the third round, but if you're talking about guys who we expect who could vault into that top 5 option at the position, I think Thielen is one of the few names for sure.
Yeah, and not only does he offer that upside, but he offers kind of that security blanket of wide receivers where, like I was saying at the beginning of the show here, is you're looking for that de facto number 1 guy, that number 1 option, and he's it. He is the number 1 wide receiver on the Vikings, and there's no question about that. And you're getting him, right now in 3rd round, early 4th round ADP, like that, after guys like Amari Cooper, who, as much as I love the Cowboys, and Amari Cooper is one of the best route runners in the NFL, down the stretch last year, he was actually the 2nd option on the Cowboys. So, there's much to be had from teams who have these multiple wide receivers. And I would rather have the guy, even though I ranked him below him, I would rather have the number 1 wideout on a team than a guy who's competing for targets.
Yeah, and I want to talk Cowboys, because I think it's in a very interesting case. As you can see from my rankings, Amari Cooper is not inside of my top 12. But before we move on, I want to talk in general about a Thielen, a Michael Thomas, guys that are Julio, guys that I know where I can get volume, and I don't have to rely. Like, obviously, touchdowns are great, and if I can get 10 or 12, I'm going to be loving life. But if there's guys that are predicated on getting those touchdown points, that if they don't get the touchdowns, if they have a 4 touchdown season instead of a 14 touchdown season, they're just going to completely tank my wide receivers. Those are guys that I'm not quite as optimistic about. And that's why I have Davante Adams at 4, because I just think things could go where, he's 7 touchdowns instead of 12 or 10, and he's not quite as good. But let's talk Cowboys, because I love Michael Gallup. I think we're going to be doing our bold predictions, and we'll definitely be talking about him. We like the potential that CeeDee Lamb has. Obviously, I think he could be a year 1 factor. Dallas obviously has vacated targets. 32% of their targets from last season are gone. Like, it was a lot of Randall Cobb, a lot of Jason Witten. It's a lot of bad targets. Those are, Michael Gallup's going to get some. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb's going to get some. Obviously, Blake Jarwin's going to get some. But for me, I don't know that I feel super like I could see all 3 of those guys having somewhere between 80 and 120 targets. And I could see Cooper and Gallup as top 20 options at wide receiver. But I don't love the idea of Amari Cooper inside my top 12 just because I think there's so many different ways that offense could go, and they could have a Zeke heavy game that I think by the end of the season, Amari Cooper's numbers will put him inside the top 12, but I feel like there will be, I don't know, 4 or 5 monster weeks and then a bunch of just whatever weeks.
I think that's kind of exactly why he's continued to fall down my rankings. And probably as I get, because I do my 2 home league drafts next weekend, just in a week's amount of time, he'll probably fall out of my top 12. Just kind of looking at where I'm drafting, doing a little mocks. Even though, like, looking at Dak, he's right up there, top 4 quarterback right now. I have him as my 4th quarterback, and I think he could easily compete for that number 1 spot if he maintains his normal, like, 4 or 5 rushing touchdowns. We're looking at a potential 5,000 yard passing season where he could throw for 40 touchdowns, even with Zeke back there. But I just don't see the separation between Cooper and Gallup, and just the percentage of targets that are going to go to Blake Jarwin, the targets that are going to go to Zeke and Tony Pollard, who they're going to have to work in there to keep Zeke healthy. And with the addition of CeeDee Lamb, who's just another tremendous athlete, I think we see all of those options kind of be up there, those ranges that you're going to want to have them on your team. But I don't think really any of them are going to wind up being an elite option at a position.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think we're both going to have a ton of Odell this year. I'm just looking at ADP. And right now, Odell is wide receiver 24 in the 5th round per fantasy football calculator. He's going, I'm trying to figure out how recent this is because Deebo Samuel's still in here. And obviously, he was a guy that was going early, so his ADP is probably still adjusting. But DJ Chark, who I like, Tyler Lockett, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, like AJ Brown. I love a lot of these guys, but I the idea that Odell is going behind all of them, it is a little crazy. I think Stefanski fixes a lot of what was wrong with the Browns last year. And last year, like, what we saw too is like what a difference the Rams had when they went from Rocks and Jeff Fisher to Sean McVay. And it's probably not as dramatic, but like what they had last year to what they have this year is I think a sizable increase. And I think a lot of people are sleeping on the Browns in terms of, we all got burned last year, all of us that dived in heavily. I think we're going to get a lot better of a season. Obviously, Austin Hooper and Jarvis Landry and all these guys. I want to get your thoughts on Allen Robinson, guy that you have as number 9. A guy that I have at number 8. So we're both, right inside that top 10. Do you think Nick Foles makes that big of a difference? Or if it's some combination of Foles starts 8 games and Trubisky starts 8 or 6 and 10 or whatever it happens to be, like the idea of Allen Robinson, like not getting that volume and peppered with targets, no matter who the quarterback is, like I think we can feel comfortable about using him week to week.
Allen Robinson, to me, is one of the most talented wide receivers on the planet. And the fact that he almost had 100 receptions and 1,200 yards last year with Mitchell Trubisky back there throwing passes, who like mind you,
bad version of Mitchell Trubisky.
Okay, so just looking at the numbers, Allen Robinson had over 33% of all the Bears' passing yards last season. And that was when Trubisky threw for 17 touchdowns. And I think Robinson had 7 of those. So he had almost half of the passing touchdowns that Trubisky threw. And if we're reading into the tea leaves right now with Trubisky gonna be the week 1 starter, and saying that Trubisky has tried to fix some of his mechanics, and the fact that they've done nothing to make any additions on the outside other than hopefully the health of Anthony Miller, Tyreek Cohen back there, maybe, who knows, maybe he'll be running in the slot, or they bring back Kevin White somehow. I just don't see a world where he's not an elite option each week for an offense that really has nothing else other than he, and if they can get the full Monty going out of the backfield. But if we see any sort of improvement out of Trubisky, I think we're looking at another monster year for a guy who quietly put up one of the best performances of the season last year.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who put up 1,400 yards with Blake Bortles and 1,200 yards with Mitchell Trubisky. So, like, if you're questioning his skill set, like, just
Yeah.
stop. And this is all, like, as you mentioned, like Anthony Miller. I love Anthony Miller. I think he can still be a good player. But if he and Tariq Cohen and the corpse of Jimmy Graham and David Montgomery are like the other options, like if he's not at like a 35-40% target rate, like I don't know what to do. I just don't get it.
And then looking even deeper into these, the fact that he caught 63.5% of his passes coming out of a he's like the pitching machine at Boomers or Family Fun Center, who it's going down and in or down and away every single time because it can't consistently put it in the same spot. Like,
yep. I mean, we were talking about Hopkins' ability to catch on balls that were off target, but Allen Robinson is just as good, if not better.
And then, another reason why I'm all in on Robinson, and I want to keep his ranking lower so that way I can draft him as much as possible, is if they were to transition the Nick Foles. To me, Nick Foles throws one of the most beautiful deep balls in the NFL, and we saw him during that first week when he was with Jacksonville. He was putting some dimes out there to DJ Chark, who, as good as Chark is, like, I don't think he's the athlete that Robinson is. And if he's able to catch those balls from Bortles and Trubisky, if we see a guy and just those kind of that touch from Foles step into there, again, or potential 1,500 yard, 10+ touchdown season easy out of that guy.
100%. All right, so we went through our top 12. Like, we talked a lot of these names. Who is the one name that, if we're talking in a couple weeks, like who gave you the biggest stress, like leaving out of your top 12? Like, was there somebody that you're like, he really should be in my top 12, but I don't have a spot for him?
It's probably Juju. It's just because we've talked about this at length. Like you have him there. He snuck into your top 12. Yeah. I'm not sure what Juju we're going to see. I'm less concerned with Ben Roethlisberger because I think we've talked about this when we talked about our quarterbacks, even an 80% Ben Roethlisberger will make everybody else around him better. But the fact that Juju, like, he didn't look the same last year minus Roethlisberger. Even with, the Mason Rudolphs and the Duck Hodges, there was going to be a downtick in output, but he didn't look like the guy the previous year with Big Ben back there who was able to make those beautiful run after catches on a consistent basis. So I think that's the one reason why I don't have him in the top 12. But if we are looking at a season where Roethlisberger is a starting quarterback and he's back to 85, 90%, he's another guy who he'll easily be up there, or should be easily in the wide receiver one conversation.
Yeah, I think the Steelers and the Browns are two offenses that you just have to wipe from your brain from last year. Like, you can't use a lot of what happened last year as reasons to draft or not to draft people this year. I think you got to give Juju another shot. You got to give Baker and company another shot. Obviously, you can still like Nick Chubb because he was great. But I think there's a lot to like about both those. I think there's gonna be a ton of value. Like, I'm just looking at ADP right now, and the fact that I can get Juju in the 6th round, Michael Gallup in the 6th round, Hollywood Brown, who didn't make mine, in the 6th round, a guy that I did get in my top 12, and that's probably going to be a little controversial, is Terry McLaurin. I think this guy is an absolute superstar in the making, and I think Dwayne Haskins will be better this year. I think we've seen Ron Rivera have the ability to be really productive with his offenses, and especially if that team's going to be as bad as they can potentially be. Like, they threw it so much last year, even with Kyle Allen under center and an anemic defense. I think we could see a very similar offense this year. And they don't have Christian McCaffrey to dump the ball off to. So I think there's going to be a ton of volume potential there. I think the Seattle guys. I think of the guys that didn't make my cut, I think Thielen is definitely that guy. I think Amari Cooper, he's probably like more in my top 20, not my top 15. AJ Brown's another guy. Like we talked about it with Matt Harmon about if the Titans offense throws a little bit more, if he is a volume hog like Thielen could be, like Allen Robinson could be, then maybe it doesn't matter. But I do have questions about that offense and how productive they were and how many times they scored once Ryan Tannehill took over and how many of his, 4 targets, 2 catches, but 160 yards, 2 touchdowns. Like that's just not sustainable on a year-to-year basis. So I have a little concern there, but I think he's, if you want to take him inside the top 12, the upside is clearly there. But yeah, I mean, I there's so many.
I think those names play into what we were talking about with I'm targeting the guys who are more likely than not to be the number one option on teams, and that's an AJ Brown, that's a Terry McLaurin, who just like you, even though he went to Ohio, he's one of my favorite breakout. I mean, even though it's not like he didn't break out last year, but he's one of my favorite candidates to like sneak up the draft boards next year and be in that top 12 range. To be a top, first 2 rounds pick because of his ability for the run after catch, and if they can develop any kind of rapport with him and Haskins. Like he is an absolute stud on the outside.
And I think it's funny because he basically started really hot and kind of faltered. Same with Hollywood Brown. If they had the opposite season where they started a little slow and caught fire at the second half, these guys would be going in the 3rd round into the 6th round. They'd be in the AJ Brown, Cortland Sutton, Calvin Ridley kind of range. So we're getting a couple round discounts on a guy that could have had the exact same season in reverse order. So I love that potential. And honestly, like I'm thinking about how I'm drafting. And if I'm looking at, okay, there's all these receivers here that I really like. That makes me more open to the idea of taking a Travis Kelce or a George Kittle who just got massive deals. That makes me more interested in maybe I go Michael Thomas and then hit receiver, whether that's Miles Sanders, whether that's Josh Jacobs, whether that's, if Kenyon Drake's your guy, like a lot of those guys in kind of that 2nd, 3rd round range. And then just come back and hammer receivers. And maybe I like the way my team, like if I go, Michael Thomas or Davante Adams or something, and then I go boom, boom with Miles Sanders, Todd Gurley, and then I take 3 of Allen Robinson, DJ Moore, Odell, Robert Woods, who I love, AJ Green, who's quietly becoming somebody I'm more interested, Juju, Terry McLaurin, like any 3 or 4 of those guys, and then just start hammering receivers again. Like I love my team in that situation.
Yeah, I think receiver has kind of turned it. I think the technique at drafting receivers has kind of transitioned with the way that we used to kind of look at running backs, which was you had to get that number 1 elite guy, and then you can just go out and just load up on those like talented dudes who could break out every week, because that's kind of what you're alluding to. If you were to take a Michael Thomas, your floor there each week with him is a certain level. Like you're going to be guaranteed double-digit points out of him. And then you go after those running backs, and then you could load up on guys like a McLaurin, like a Moore, like an Odell, like an AJ Green, who could have weeks where they also explode, which gives you the highest upside on a weekly basis, which is what you're trying to do in a season-long, fantasy league.
100%. Brian, this is a ton of fun. Obviously, talked all the receivers. I love this position. I think we will be coming back to receivers and talking more guys because there is so many names. Before we get out of here, if you're enjoying what we're doing, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you give us a thumbs up on the video. If you're listening on Stitcher, or iTunes, or Spotify, leave a review if that application offers it. If you're on YouTube, in the comments, let us know which receiver going outside the top 12 that you really like and think could jump into the top 12. Maybe we mentioned him, maybe we didn't. Maybe you're a big, Marquise Brown fan or Marco Gallup fan, or, we can dig a little deep. If you're a Brandon Cooks or Will Fuller or McCole Hardman, like go off. Tell us who your favorite option is that you think come the end of the season, we're talking about him as a top 12-ish type receiver. Let us know in the comments, and we'll try and talk about some of our favorite ones on the next episode. If you missed the quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, they're all up on our YouTube page. Go give those a listen. But for Brian Twining, I'm Kyle Robert, and we'll talk to you guys next time.